Hey guys, this is an area of my yard that I normally don't cut. I just let it do what it wants to do. I let weeds grow in it. I let seedlings come down and grow in it. But I'm going to show you the magic of turning this weeded, very overgrown area into this right here, liquid gold, liquid, I guess you might call it liquid black gold. But it's a really easy process and it is completely natural and it works unbelievably well in your vegetable garden, on your flowers, ornamentals, trees, shrubs, berries. So let me get to the greenhouse and I'll show you exactly how to put this together. It is not hard. It is a super simple thing, but it makes a huge difference in your vegetable garden or ornamental garden. Now, before we head into the greenhouse, I want to give you a demonstration of exactly what this liquid will do. This is eggplant. It's all Japanese eggplant. And I want to show you that one side of the bed, I've did this trick with the weed fertilizer. The right side, I did not. No weed fertilizer on this side. These are almost half the height of these. So, and these are producing every day. We're collecting 2 or 3 a day. It's just producing unbelievably well. So this works great. I just wanted to do this little experiment and divide the bed in half with these eggplants and show you that yes, these are still growing and they are producing slowly, but these are just have gone crazy. They've doubled or tripled in size and they are just producing eggplants like there's no tomorrow. Now this is about 3 weeks growth of just weeds. It looks like grass, but actually this is just different types of weeds, seedlings, trees that have dropped their seeds and they've just started growing there. All sorts of weeds are growing in that area. I have no grass in that area, so this is just all weeds in that area. But this is just a couple of passes on my riding mower. You can do this also with a push mower. You can do it manually by hand, but with a mower you can chop it into a finer amount, and that helps it break down faster. So I would recommend if you have a mower with a bagger, use the mower to do it because it saves you one step of having to cut it manually and mince it into small amounts like this. Now I'd say to start this process, you want to use a 5-gallon bucket because you may not be able to tolerate some of the smells this is going to produce. And I'll show you a little bit later a way you can reduce the smell. It involves an aquarium filter, but that will definitely cut back on the smells. But you want to have your weeds chopped as finely as possible. So if you have to do it by hand with a pair of shears or cutters, you definitely want to do that if you don't have a mower. But what you're going to end up with is something like this. It looks like wheat tea. And it will take anywhere from 3 to 4 weeks to get to this process. And the longer you leave it in there, let's say 6 months to a year, it's gonna look a little bit more like that. But it can stay in there indefinitely. You could use this multiple years later. Some farmers actually do this and they do not use their tea. They have it sitting in a barrel somewhere and they collect it later and add it to their small vegetable patch, maybe a personal vegetable patch. And it can really make a difference, that's for sure. Now I'm going to go over some of the rules of doing this, and it's really important to just collect the green part. You don't have to collect the root system because the green part of these weeds is where most of your nutrients are at. So you want to do that. You don't have to worry about if you're pulling these, you can just throw the roots away and keep the green part to go into your tea product. So just remember you can do that. And also it's another good idea to do this earlier in the morning when the plant is most hydrated and most likely to have the maximum amount of nutrition in it. Now, another really important thing to take into account is the weeds that you're collecting. Has this area ever been treated with a granular or liquid herbicide? Even if it's been last year, you want to try to avoid that. So you want to collect these in an area that you're not treating for weeds, even if it's been in the past. This area that I showed you previously has not been treated probably well over 10 years, so it's a safe area to collect the weeds from. And if it did have any type of herbicide in it that didn't affect the weed, once you put it into your vegetable garden, it could have an effect on those. So just remember, you want it to be a very pure weed if possible, because you don't want to kill your vegetables after you work so hard to get them to start producing. Now, birds in my area constantly are dropping seeds everywhere, and poison ivy always seems to pop up where those birds have been. So I'm assuming that some of the things on the poison ivy, there's a berry, something like that they've eaten and they've dropped it, and poison ivy always seems to pop up. So remember, you want to learn to identify poison ivy, poison sumac, and poison oak, because you don't want that going into your mix for obvious reasons, for irritation, and it might end up causing a problem with your vegetables in the end product. Now, if you're chopping these by hand, you want to try to chop them to about 1 to 2 inches each, because the shorter and more compact size that you cut them into are going to release nutrients quicker, and they'll decompose quicker as well. If you have a weed eater but you don't have a lawnmower or a bagger or something like that, you can just put a lot of weeds that you've collected in a pile and run over it with a weed eater and chop them into smaller pieces. That'll save you a lot of effort. But if you don't have a weed eater, then you're going to go back to just manually cutting them into small 1 to 2 inch strips. Now, another important thing to think about or to consider is what time of year are you collecting the weeds, because if you do it earlier in the season, just after spring, you'll probably be more likely to be collecting weeds that have not gone to seed. So if there's a lot of seeds, you want to avoid those because they could finally end up in the vegetable garden at some point if you don't use the proper type of filtration and netting. I can show you exactly what I'm using. I use this to dip down into my bucket and scoop the weeds out so I don't get any possible seeds that might be in there. But you can also use fabric, an old t-shirt, something like that to keep the weeds from ending up in your solution that's going to be poured at the base of your plant. So just remember, you want to try to do this early in the year and start your weed compost tea early. Now, I think the perfect size to start doing this is a small 5-gallon bucket rather than going all out and using the large buckets. You can use the 55-gallon containers or a trash can, but when you're using these small buckets, you're a little bit more assured that they're food safe. When you look on the bottom, you're looking for a triangle with a number 2 in the middle and HDPE. This was a pickle bucket from Firehouse Subs, and you can get these really cheap, and it goes to a good cause. So just remember, to start with, I would go with a 5-gallon bucket. From there, if it really works for you, if you really think you're going to continue doing this and you can tolerate the odor that it will produce, then you could bump it up to a larger size bucket. However, I would keep the container away from direct sunlight. Just kind of let it sit in the shade and do its magic. Also, you want to keep it probably away from areas, maybe seating areas, or a lot of people are congregating, like a patio, because it does produce a good bit of smell. So you just want to kind of have it a little bit out of the way. Now, as far as using a metal container, you don't want to do that because it may have a reaction with the acidic nature of the tea. So stick with plastic, or if you have a wooden bucket, that's great. But again, metal is something you should avoid when you're doing this process because of the acidic nature. Now, one thing to take into account is if you'll just spend a few dollars on an aquarium pump that will put oxygen into the water, that will also help quite a bit. It's one of those things that's not absolutely necessary, but it will help cut down on the smell and put some beneficial bacteria inside of the container. So it's not, like I said, it's not a must, but I think it'll make it a little bit easier to deal with once you start working with it, and you'll understand what I'm talking about, because it is quite a putrid smell once you get it into the fermentation state. Now, the way you want to mix this is you want to fill your bucket about 2/3 of the way up. Pack it as tightly as you can, but one of the most important things I can tell you is you want your weeds completely covered in water. So pack it as tightly as you can. Fill the bucket until it's above the level of the weeds. And once you do that, you're going to put a lid on it. If you don't have a container with a lid, you don't have to worry about it. But if you have a lot of mosquitoes in your area, then that could be a problem. So a lid will make a difference if you do have a lot of mosquitoes. Now, as I mentioned, it's a good idea just to cover it. You don't have to have something that's a tight seal, because there could be a little bit of fermentation gases that could build up. So just set it on there if you have a board or anything like that. And if you want to do something just to make sure there's no mosquitoes in it, you can add some mosquito bits to it. It's a perfectly safe product, safe around pets. I'll put a link to these in the description. But just gently set a lid, piece of wood, whatever on top of it. And again, keep it out of direct sunlight so it doesn't overheat. Now, one thing that's important to take into account is where is your water coming from that you're using for your weed tea. If you're using a water that has high chlorine or high minerals or hard water, you want to avoid that. I have a well on property, so the water that I have is not hard water, and it has 0 chlorine in it. So just remember, if you don't have access to well water, you could use distilled water, or just have a rain barrel set up. That's one of the projects I have planned, is to set up a series of rain barrel videos for you that shows you the easiest way to make that work. But again, you want to use water that does not contain chlorine or other harsh chemicals. Now, another thing I would recommend doing, even if you are using an aquarium pump, is to stir the mixture to make sure you have an even distribution of the interior contents and the minerals, and that way you don't end up with a clump of minerals maybe in one area of the bucket and not in the other. So when you go to collect your weed tea, is you don't have a proper distribution and you're not getting the most out of it. So just make sure you use something like a paint stick, stir it maybe every 1 to 3 days, and just that will also help with the bacterial growth, the positive bacterial growth, and keep some of the odors down that if you're not using an aquarium pump. Now, I'm anticipating the question that a lot of people are going to ask is, how are you going to know when your weed tea is ready? And you're going to need to think about timing as well. So you want to make sure that this is over 30 days inside of the bucket in a nice shady area, fermenting and doing all the good things that it's going to do. So just remember, the first rule in making sure that it's ready is to wait more than 30 days. And really, you could do this, if you want to put it in a greenhouse or in a storage shed, you could store it over the winter, and then next spring you'll be ready to go. Because timing, it can go for years in this bucket, and it can continue to have its minerals and its positive content in there, and it won't get any worse. It'll only get better with time, just like a fine wine. Now, some of the other ways you can tell that your weed tea is ready is it's going to have an earthy, strong, and somewhat unpleasant odor. So that tells you that it's done its magic. But the other thing to take a look at is, are the weeds broken down? Are they started to kind of change color and look rather mushy? That's another way you can tell that your weed tea is almost ready. Now, another way you can tell that your weed tea is really ready is you'll see the fermentation action of a lot of bubbles, and it should have a really dark, rich color, almost like a dark liquor color. So just remember, you're looking for that fermentation process to be well on its way before you collect it. Now, about collecting your weed tea in small batches is you want to use something like this that you can put down in your 5-gallon bucket, and you can dip your container in and dip out what you need before you mix it. And I'll tell you about your mixing ratio in just 1 second. But if you don't have a strainer like this, you can use a t-shirt, put it over the cap or the top of your bottle, put it down into your weed tea, and let it fill your jar without collecting any possible seeds. So that's a really important thing, is you want to make sure you strain it before you put it into your watering container and then take it out to your garden. So you want to keep the seeds out of your garden. Now, your dilution ratio is going to be about 1 part of your collected weed tea that you've got stored here in your, I'd like to put it in the mason jars, to 10 parts water. So you want to make sure you dilute your weed tea, because you don't want to burn any of your existing plants. And it's also important to do a test plant to make sure that the reaction to the weed tea is not a negative one. So just remember, just do 1 plant at a time, wait a few days and see how it reacts. But as long as you follow that general rule of 1 part weed tea to 10 parts water, you should be okay. Now, there is one exception to that, is if you've allowed your weed tea to sit for an extremely long period of time, over 6 months, then you may want to dilute it even more, 1 part weed tea to 20 parts water. Another way you're going to apply this to your vegetable plants is you just want to apply it right at the base of the plant. Avoid getting a lot of your weed tea on the flower, on the leaves, because that can cause a little bit of leaf burn. So just remember, we're focusing on the root system because this is a concentrated fertilizer, and we want to keep it off of the leaves. Now, another thing to remember is that if you do want to do a foliar feeding where you're spraying the leaves, and you go to that 1 in 20 part and do 1 test plant to see if the particular plant you're wanting to do a foliar feeding is okay. You may actually have to go, if you have a really strong amount of nutrients in there, you may have to go to 1 part water to 1 part tea to 30 parts water. So just remember, you don't want to burn the leaves of your plant. We're focusing on the root system in its concentrated form. Now, my tomatoes seem to be loving the foliar feeding that I'm doing in this very noisy sprayer, which sounds like a wounded goose. I'll just come through here and I'll do a light foliar feeding. This is a 1 to 30 part ratio because I don't want to take a chance on burning any of my leaves. So I'm spraying the foliar area of my tomato plants late in the evening. I would recommend you do it late evening or early morning in the cooler time of the day, and just give it a light spray, light misting throughout your tomato plants, cucumber, squash, whatever you got growing. Just give it a light spray there. But remember, very weak solution. You don't want to do the full concentrated. Now, I'm anticipating this question is that a lot of people will ask me, how often do you do this type of feeding to the root system? And I would say about every 2 weeks during the growing season. And the foliar feeding about the same, but remember, we're talking about different dilution rates there. So I just don't want you to accidentally foliar feed with what you would put on the root. So you don't want to mix those two up, because you will have leaf burn. With the nutritional product we have here, it'll be like putting a massive amount of fertilizer on the leaves themselves. So just remember, about every 2 weeks during the growing season. Now, another question I'm anticipating everyone asking me is, how long does the tea solution last once you've mixed it? Now, inside of the container where it's fermenting, that can stay in there for years. But once I mix it in the container, I use it all right then and there. I don't use it and then just set it aside and let it sit. So I'll make up a new batch each time from the fermented tea water, and then use everything I've got, and then I'll just keep doing this process every 2 weeks during the growing season. And as you can see, the vegetables really love it. Now, I've created some other videos, one about using yeast in the garden. I'll put that up above. Also, another one is about using citric acid in the garden, something that most people would never think of. I'll put that up above as well. So there's a lot of formulas I'm working on this month before the growing season is over. I just want to put up as many as I can, so I'll put those up above, and I hope you'll take a look at them. So guys, I really appreciate you watching, and I hope you'll subscribe, and have a great day.